This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's normally what I do in this series. From time to time, I like to take a break from those data-driven looks at the best cards in the game and instead look at the worst cards in the game. And that's what we're doing today with a look at the worst Boros cards ever. The cards that end up on this kind of list get there based mostly on my own opinion about the card, but I do use a little bit of data in selecting my picks. It wouldn't make much sense for any card to be on this list if it has ever top-8'd a Premier event or if it's a widely played card in EDH. If either of those things are true about a card, it just isn't eligible for this list because it can't really be a bad card. Most of the cards on the list also weren't very good in their respective limited formats either. In addition to that, a card had to have a Boros color identity to end up here. This means that the card has both the red and white mana symbols somewhere on the card, with no other colored mana symbols appearing. This can mean that the card can simply cost red and white mana to cast, but a card that only costs red to cast, but has a white activated ability, and vice versa, also has a Boros color identity. In all, there are 242 cards with a Boros color identity, and in this video I'll give you my picks for the 10 worst of the bunch. At number 10, I included two cards because they're pretty similar: Boros Fury Shield and Reflect Damage. These are by far the most widely played EDH cards on this list, but 147 and 237 decks out of 144,000 isn't exactly impressive, and I really feel like these should be played significantly less. I'm never a huge fan of effects that just prevent damage. This is because they really only matter in situations where you can win the game or build a big advantage as a result of them. This is why fogs are often not the greatest cards except for in very particular decks. These two cards both stop damage only from a single source, so they aren't nearly as broadly useful as fogs can be, but they do make up for it a little bit by being able to redirect the damage. But the effects they have are still way too narrow. Boros Fury Shield only stops damage from one attacking or blocking creature. And yeah, if you pay red for it, you also get to damage that creature's controller, but that just won't matter often enough. Meanwhile, Reflect Damage can stop any source of damage, but 5 mana is a ton for such a narrow effect. Now, of course, these will sometimes feel great. There will be times where this just kills your opponent because their creature is absolutely massive, but more often than not, you're just preventing some damage and doing some damage to your opponent, and that's not worth a card most of the time. There are a lot of bad cards that are good in super specific situations, but what makes a card bad is its average usefulness, and these two are abysmal when you look at them that way. At number 9, I have Moonhold. This card does have kind of a cool effect, as if you pay both red and white for it and cast it on your opponent's upkeep, it can really alter their turn. And yeah, it is tempting to think of the times where your opponent was planning on playing a land and casting a creature on their turn, because you really ruin their life when you stop both of those things from happening. And if that's what this always did, it would be worth a card. However, there are plenty of times where casting this basically does nothing or does very little. You really have to be reaping the benefit of both parts of the card for it to be worth it, and frequently your opponent won't have a land anyways, or wasn't planning on playing a creature anyway. In those scenarios, you end up going down a card for nothing. Your opponent will often be able to find something to do even if you do cast this, and if that's true, well, you just basically wasted a card. So yeah, sometimes this can really annoy your opponent, but more often than not, it won't be doing what you want it to. At number 8, I have Screeching Griffin. While not as interesting to talk about as the number 10 and number 9 entries on this list, Screeching Griffin is comparably terrible. A 4-mana 2/2 flyer is abysmal, and the ability to make creatures unable to block, it doesn't really make up for that. And sure, since it has flying, you really only need to stop 1 or 2 creatures from blocking for it to get in, but if your opponent has their own flyers who can block this effectively, they're probably going to be beating you in the race in the sky since your 4-mana flyer is only a 2/2. At number 7, it is Craniosaurus, another card that is simultaneously bad and uninteresting. A 5-mana 5/2 is bad as it dies to pretty much everything and can be blocked by a whole slew of creatures that can kill it. It makes up for that a little bit because it has an ability which makes it into a 5/5 until end of turn, but the mana investment you're putting into the card just isn't worth the payoff. Imagine if this was a 5-mana 5/5 with that ability, and it still wouldn't be especially good, though it certainly would have been a lot better in limited than it actually was. At number 7, I have Priest of Eros. This is the kind of card people really overrate. They see it as a 1-mana 1/1 with upside, and yeah, in a technical sense, that's what it is, but a 1-mana 1/1 really has to have significant upside to be worth it most of the time. Paying 4 to give this up and blow up an enchantment isn't exactly a good deal, especially because there are so many other cards out there that can hate on enchantments, and they either do it more efficiently, or they are actually useful cards up until the point that you use them to blow up that enchantment, and neither of those things are true here. At number 5, it is Hoof Cavalry. This is another 1-mana 1/1 with upside, but like I just said, a 1-mana 1/1 really has to have significant upside to be worth it most of the time, and this doesn't do it either. Its ability is very expensive and doesn't even do anything to save the cavalry. It just lets it do more damage. I mean, if your opponent blocks this with a 2/2, you have to pay 4 mana just to make sure that it ends up being a trade, and at that point it really isn't a trade, since you're investing a ton of mana into killing something your opponent only paid 2 for. And imagine if they block with a 1-mana 1/2. That's an even more miserable situation. And yeah, if you have 1,000,000 mana, this can trample over for a bunch, but if you have that much mana, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of better things you could be doing with it. At number 4, I have Orion Commando. This is another highly inefficient Boros creature with an activated ability that really doesn't do enough to overcome it. In this case, you're getting a 4-mana 4/1. 1 toughness is just awful on a creature that expensive without any evasion, as just about anything can block it and it dies. It tries to overcome that with its ability, which lets you prevent 1 damage at a time, but it just isn't realistic to think that you'll have enough spare white mana lying around to make it so this doesn't die to something as trivial as 2 or 3 damage. You basically have to hamper your own ability to add to the board if you want to keep it alive, and your payoff is still just a 4-power creature, so it isn't worth it. At number 3, I have Flash Conscription. This is definitely my pick for the most interesting card on the list, but unfortunately for Flash Conscription, interesting doesn't mean good. This is a super expensive threaten effect. Red effects that steal a creature until end of turn and give them haste usually cost 3 mana. Even 4 for an effect like this is way too much, so you can see how 6 is insane. This tries to offset the really high mana cost in 2 ways. First, it is an instant, and that means you can steal an opposing creature and use it to block one of your opponent's other attackers, and it's tempting to imagine that always giving you a 2-for-1, but you need things to line up just right for that to work out. In particular, your opponent has to have 2 creatures that just kill each other in combat, and depending on what they attacked with and what the rest of their board looks like, that just isn't always going to happen. In fact, more often than not, it just won't. The other thing Conscription does is that if you pay white mana, you also give the creature pseudo lifelink, but that's not really enough either. 6 mana for a super situational instant is rough, especially because a good chunk of the time, you won't even be able to change the board with it in any meaningful way. At number 2, it is Suleimans Legacy. This enchantment hates on 2 creature types. It destroys all djinns and ifrits when it enters the battlefield. This is kind of an interesting card because if Magic were a little bit different, it could actually be pretty strong. Like if djinns and ifrit were representative race creature types we saw in every single set, this would be a pretty powerful sideboard card. Imagine exchanging djinns and ifrits for goblins and merfolk, for example. So this is a weird card in that what it does, it actually does a pretty good job of. And if you can even kill 1 djinn or ifrit with it, you're actually doing just fine. But the problem is, djinns and ifrits are not super common as a creature type, though we did just get a bunch more of them in Strixhaven, so I guess one could say that Suleiman's Legacy recently got a lot better. But yeah, until djinns and or ifrits become a bigger thing in Magic, this is a terrible card since it will do absolutely nothing on 99.9% of boards. And at number 1, it's Heroism. This is a weird card, mostly because it isn't as Boros as the other cards on this list. This is because the player who controls Heroism generally isn't paying both white and red mana for it, but it technically has a Boros color identity, so there you go. So, yeah, this card is absolutely terrible. It's meant to be a white card that hoses red decks, but it's awful at doing it. You have to sacrifice a white creature to fog all of your opponent's red attackers. We've already been over the fact that fogs aren't great, and this is a pretty terrible version of it, partly because you have to give up a white creature to make it happen, and partly because your opponent can choose to ignore it if they have the mana to pay. You just won't be doing anything if this is your game plan every turn, as your board will eventually be whittled down and those red creatures will start hitting you. If you're looking for white ways to hose red decks, there are dozens of better ways to do it. Well, those are my picks for the 10 worst Boros cards ever. If you're interested in purchasing any of these cards because, I don't know, maybe you want some new coasters, you can find direct Card Kingdom links for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the old ones, including many more on the worst cards ever, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.